Hello and welcome to my first chess commentary. I'm called Jocasmo. I was rated 1707 and my opponent at that time, Ersantos, was rated 1797. This game was played a year ago on the free internet chess server. It was a standard 15-minute game. So I opened up the game with a queen's pawn opening and he used the French defense. Pawn to e6. So his move allowed me to immediately move my own pawn to e4 to control the center. So now I have two central pawns controlling all of those four squares in front of my pawns. He moves b6, preparing to fianchetto, and move knight to c3. And he fianchettos his bishop, and I move g3 to prepare my own fianchetto. He pins my knight to my king, and he's basically threatening to take my knight and then take my pawn. So I move bishop to g2 to protect my pawn. At the same time, I'm putting my own light square bishop opposite his light square bishop, so we're on the same diagonal. He takes my knight, and I take it back with my b pawn. So now I have double up pawns on the c file, which is not that much of a, well, it's not that bad because my dot square bishop now can always come up to a3 if I decide to control this long diagonal towards his king side. Generally, you do not want to have double pawns on the b file, but c files are okay most of the time. So he moves his knight to f6. I move bishop to g5 to pin his knight to his queen. He threatens my bishop with his pawn, and at this time I decide to take his knight because his knight and bishop were threatening my pawn on e4 and I only had one defender. So at this point I was expecting him to take back with his own pawn, but instead he took with his queen, which allowed me to have a nice discovery, just moving my pawn up from e4 to e5, which threatens his queen, but at the same time opens up this h diagonal. So let's see what happens if he decides to save his queen. He can move his queen back to d8, and I would have taken his bishop. He would have moved his knight to c6. I would have taken his rook, and he would have taken my bishop back. So that's basically a free rook, and I would have gained 5 points of material. But instead, after thinking about the move for a minute, he decided to take my bishop. So he's basically letting me have his queen, which is worth 9 points, for my bishop, which is worth 3 points, and my rook, which is worth 5 points. 9 points for 8 points. And I was totally fine with that. But it certainly does not guarantee me a win straight away. So I take his pawn. He attacks my pawn with his rook, and I move up my queen to protect my pawn. He moves knight to c6, a development move, and prepares to castle his king. I move my knight from g2 to e2. He castles queenside, and I also castle queenside, and at the same time I'm threatening his bishop, so he pulls his bishop back to d5. I move up my knight and attacks his bishop. So at this point, because I'm winning, I want to trade down material, but instead he takes my pawn on a2. I move my king up to b2 to attack his bishop, and he pulls it back to c4, which is a very nice outpost for his bishop right now, and it's really hard for me to get to it. So I move my knight to h5. This move basically means that the knight has thoughts of going to f6 and attack his rook. So he moved his knight to e7 to as the second defender to g8, where my pawn intends to queen. At this point, I had two moves that I could have made which were better than the move that I actually made in the game. The first move was queen to f3. Now this move threatens checkmate in 1 if the queen is allowed to get to a8. It also threatens the f7 pawn. So that was one move I could have made. Let me go back here. The second move was knight to f6, which threatens his rook, and his rook has nowhere safe to go because all of those 4 squares are taken, and if he decided to take my pawn, I could have taken back with my queen. So he probably would have lost his rook for a knight. But instead of that move, I decided to move rook from d1 to e1. So basically the move was intended to improve the position of my rook, but that was a pretty bad move because it allowed my opponent to move pawn to f5, which threatens my queen. And right now my queen doesn't want to leave g4 because that's a pretty good square and it's protecting my pawn right now. But it's currently attacked, and I decided to move it to f4. And he moves his knight to d5, a centralizing move, and at the same time attacks my queen. So I decided to take his pawn, take his h-pawn, and he moves c6. I'm not sure exactly what this move was intended to do. I think it's just a waiting move. He wants to see what I will be doing, what my plan is. So I move my queen up to h7. He moves his pawn to a5. He could be thinking about a pawn storm on my king, but he really doesn't have that much time to complete a pawn storm. I move my rook to e5. At this point, I just want to trade off my rook for his knight because I'm winning, and also because his knight is defending f6, this square, which is where my knight wants to go. So he moves his rook opposite my rook, which is, again, I guess not the best move because now when my knight comes to f6, it's basically hitting both of his rooks. So I exchange my rook for his knight. He takes back with the bishop, and I move my knight to f6. And this is basically the magic square that my knight wants to be. It's attacking both his rooks and also this key g8 square where my pawn wants to queen. So at this point he moves his pawn up to allow his bishop to see this g8 square and protect his rook. And at this point I could have taken one of his rooks with my knight, but I know that I can take it anytime I want, so I decided to take this pawn with my queen. So I move my queen to f5, and he moves his bishop to e6, attacking my queen. I take the other pawn on e5, and then right now there isn't really a good discovery for him because my king is on a dog square and his bishop can't really attack anything. Actually, most of my pieces are on dog squares except this one pawn on c2, which is protected by my king, so he doesn't really have a really good discovery. He moves pawn to b5, so continuing with his pawn storm, and I take his rook. At this point he takes back with his rook, and it's pretty much just winning the game from here on. I move my h-pawn up to support my g-pawn in order to queen one of them. He moves his bishop back. I move my queen to f6, and just a few moves later he makes a blunder and moves his rook up to attack my queen, but that just allows me to move my queen to f8 and check him and take his bishop. So at this point he resigned. Good game to ersantos, and hope you enjoyed this video. Rating and comments are appreciated.